Welcome to part 3 of industry analysis. In this part, I'll be looking at how to undertake and present a five forces analysis. It's always a good start in your analysis when presenting it to show a summary of the analysis you've conducted and then subsequently to go on and describe in more detail, discuss in more detail how you arrived at that summary. This has the benefit that as you start to discuss your analysis, the reader has an overall view of where you're heading. This is one example of a summary presentation of a five forces analysis. It clearly shows the five forces, it shows the level of those forces, and it's also got a few notes against each force, which is a brief nod towards the key elements of those forces that contribute to that assessed level. It doesn't always have to be this color or in these circles, but you could see that it's a useful starting point. It gives an overall picture for the reader. However, there are some points which you might like to think about which could improve the way in which this is presented. An alternative way of presenting your summary is to use this form of spider diagram. This is particularly useful perhaps to compare different analyses over time. So you might show how the industry was structured 5 years ago, how it is now, and maybe how you expect it to be in the future, considering different changes. This is a good way of presenting that summary. Perhaps again, though, you could think of ways in which this particular way could be improved. So let's think about the steps in actually applying the framework. The first starting point is to define carefully the industry, and particularly, of course, the strategic group within that industry in which you're going to focus your analysis. That will then enable you to clarify who the key buyers are, or who the key groups of buyers are. If we think about the UK grocery retailing market, the buyers are quite simple to identify. It's millions and millions of everyday consumers like you and me. In other industries, it's slightly more complex. If we looked at car manufacturing, then whilst there might be some individuals who buy cars direct from the manufacturers, predominantly manufacturers will sell to dealer networks, and those dealer networks might be independent of the manufacturer, or they might be owned by the manufacturer. They might sell cars direct to large groups of buyers, such as leasing companies, or large fleets, such as car hire companies. Those different groups have different characteristics and different levels of power. So it's important to understand how the buying is done, by whom, and amongst those different groups, if there is a different level of power, and overall, which group has the highest level of influence over the manufacturers. The same applies to identifying key suppliers or groups of suppliers. All industries will have a wide range of different suppliers, some with very low power, some with very high power. And it's important to understand the distribution of power across those different suppliers, and again to identify those with the greatest amount of influence over the industry. Once you've focused what exactly you're going to be analyzing, so you know who it is within the strategic groups, who are the rivals, you know who the key buyers are, you know who the key suppliers are. You can then collect data in order to assess these different elements within each different force. For that, you might be looking at company level data, which gives you clues to what individual companies are saying about what goes on in their industry. So looking at the annual reports of larger companies within your strategic group. You might be looking at industry data. So there's often industry associations which will collect data for their members. Or you might be looking at government, national level data. or commentary from industry analysts. You need to consider and present a discussion of each force in the logical sequence: threat of entry, threat of substitutes, power of buyers, power of suppliers, and then consider the individual elements of rivalry and the effect of the other four forces on the level of rivalry. Then you need to firmly determine the level of each force. This is where you have to make a decision. Which do you think are low, medium and high? And you have to provide data to support your conclusions. Remember, you're trying to persuade people of a point of view. You're trying to persuade people that your analysis is credible. So you need to supply data. You need to supply that data in a simple and clear format as possible. So the use of diagrams, graphs and so forth, tables, is very helpful to present lots of information and start to show if there is a pattern behind the industry strategy. Behind the industry structure. Having identified the level of each force and the key elements of each force, part of your discussion will be what is the effect of those forces in, or each of those forces in the industry in which you're looking at. So remember, increasing threat of entry, the more people or the more firms operating in a particular sector, the higher the level of competition. That gives buyers perhaps more choice, so perhaps that allows buying power to increase. That will lead to pressure on price. Firms in the industry will start to compete in price. Perhaps retaliation to new entrants will be by reducing prices, and that will have an effect, a negative effect, on the profitability within the industry. Similarly, as the level of substitutes increases, that can have the effect of decreasing the market size. Again, similar to the threat of entry, then that can increase rivalry, increase price pressure, and again subsequently decrease the level of profitability. The more power that suppliers have, perhaps they can start to increase the costs incurred by the industry. As costs go up, then that can have the influence over decreasing profitability. On the other side of the equation, if buying power is increasing, then that often manifests itself in a need to decrease price, which again has the effect of decreasing profitability. The worst situation for an industry, of course, is where supplier power is increasing, so costs are going up, buyer power is increasing, so prices are coming down, and that has a double effect on decreasing the level of profitability. Finally, if rivalry increases, then all firms are threatened by decreasing market share. Perhaps the key point of competition will be around decreasing price, which has the effect of decreasing profitability. So some of the key things you need then, having discussed each force individually and start to consider how they integrate in terms of producing the level of profitability and therefore the level of attraction in the industry, you also need to consider how is the microenvironment affecting the industry. So the industry doesn't operate within a bubble. It is affected by the macro environment. So what's going on in the macro environment that might be affecting any or all of the forces? So what changes are coming about because of the interaction between macro environmental changes and industry level changes? So you need to make sure that the conclusions you write include an integration of the macro analysis with the industry analysis. So what you'll be considering is, what are the big changes, how much are the changes affecting the industry, and how quickly. When are the changes going to have a real effect upon the industry? Subsequently, if you've got these parts of the analysis and discussion, then you can start to consider in detail implications for the industry over the longer term, and the strengths and weaknesses of the various players or competitors in relation to all these forces. The key elements of a strategy that can be crafted will then acknowledge the dominant forces. So what you must remember is ultimately, having conducted a macro analysis and then conducted an industry level analysis and understood how the two interact, so integrate a discussion about those two, then that will become the basis of crafting a strategy for any particular firm that either wishes to compete more strongly in the industry or perhaps wants to enter that industry. So a final analysis. Remember, 5 forces as a form of industry analysis looked at an industry, not individual companies. So it's performed for strategic groups within industry, and it's performed at strategic business unit level when we're considering which large firms, if there are large firms, are active in that particular sector or strategic group. Remember, we don't just want you to describe the forces. We want you to be able to give a credible assessment of the strength, high, medium or low, and that means providing data to support your conclusions in order to present a credible and persuasive analysis. So you need to be very clear on which force or combination of forces are the most influential in your particular strategic group. Different industries, different strategic groups will have a different pattern of these forces at play. Furthermore, within each of those most influential forces, you need to be quite clear about which particular elements which compose the whole force have the most influence on that force, and therefore might be a key element to consider when assessing the overall attraction of the sector. And finally, an industry analysis doesn't stand alone, but it must be in combination with a relevant macro analysis. Don't forget to do the relevant reading this week, and there's also a short video available for you through StudySpace in which Michael Porter himself discusses his analysis. So it's interesting perhaps to see the actual creator of this framework talking about his work.